Hello everyone tonight. I want to tell you a story that has haunted my village for generations. A tale that begins on a foggy cold night. When Mara, a young woman driven by curiosity and a restless heart, wandered away from the familiar paths of her village into the dense forest that everyone avoided after sunset. A forest where the mist clung to the ground like living fingers, twisting around the roots of ancient trees and crawling up the trunks like pale veins of some sleeping giant. And as she stepped deeper, the shadows seemed to shift, forming shapes just beyond her vision. And though her heart pounded in her chest with every step, she could not turn back. For she had heard stories of a lantern that appeared only on nights like this, floating above the ground with an otherworldly glow, a light that promised answers but delivered terror, and the villagers spoke of those who had followed it, who never returned, whose voices were swallowed by the forest, whose eyes had been lost to the shadows, and yet Mara felt a compulsion, a magnetic pull drawing her forward, whispering her name on the wind, beckoning her into the unknown. And she stepped cautiously over tangled roots and slick stones, the air growing colder with each breath until she saw it. A lantern suspended in mid-air, its flame flickering unnaturally, casting shadows that writhed like tortured spirits across the mossy ground. And as she approached, she noticed that the light seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, sending tremors through the ground and ripples through the fog. And she could hear faint whispers emerging from the mist, soft at first, then growing louder, overlapping voices of people she once knew, long-dead relatives, childhood friends, neighbors who had vanished, all calling to her, urging her forward, promising reunion, promising comfort. But beneath it all, Mara felt the sinister undertone of those whispers, the hint of a trap, a darkness that had nothing to do with her village, her life, her memories, and she froze, her fingers trembling as she reached out, brushing the lantern's surface, feeling a heat that was not warm, but intrusive, as if the light itself was probing her, testing her, claiming a piece of her soul. And in that instant, the forest shifted, the path behind her dissolving into shadow, the trees bending unnaturally, the fog thickening into solid walls of gray, and Mara realized she was no longer in the world she knew, that the lantern had transported her to a realm between life and death, where time did not exist and reality bent like water, and in the distance, a figure emerged from the mist, tall and cloaked, faceless, holding a lantern identical to the one that had drawn her in, radiating a presence that was suffocating and commanding, and the whispers coalesced into a single voice, cold and insistent. "Stay!" Mara's mind screamed at her to run, yet every step forward seemed predestined, drawn by the lantern's irresistible force, and as she moved, the shadows began to take shape. Faces forming from the mist, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with eternal anguish, hands reaching for her as if to pull her into their endless night, and she could feel the cold seep into her bones. But strangely, there was no panic, only a surreal calm, a sense that she was caught in the middle of something older than the village, older than life itself, and each step brought new horrors. The ground beneath her pulsing as if alive, the trees bending and twisting like grotesque sentinels, the whispers forming memories she had long buried. Regrets clawing at her heart, moments of shame and sorrow rising to the surface, and through it all, the lantern hovered ahead, its light blinding, yet beckoning, promising revelation and doom in equal measure. And Mara could see fleeting visions within the glow, lost children wandering, lovers separated, soldiers screaming in endless battle, all trapped in their personal torments, all drawn by the same lantern, all part of its unending cycle. And then the cloaked figure raised its head, or what passed for a head, and whispered words that seemed to echo in Mara's mind, piercing her thoughts. "All who see the lantern are chosen, and all who follow it must serve." And in that instant, she understood the terrible truth. The lantern did not merely attract the lost, it recruited them, binding them to its light, enslaving them in a limbo of horror and memory. And yet, amidst the overwhelming terror, Mara felt a spark, a fragment of will, a thread of power that she could cling to, and she focused, holding on to the essence of herself, the memories that were hers alone, trying to resist, trying to survive. But the lantern flared brighter, blinding her, and she was lifted off the ground, floating among countless souls, each suspended in its own nightmare, reaching pleading calling, and the whispers became a chorus, a deafening tide of sorrow and longing threatening to overwhelm her, erasing her identity. Yet she clung tighter to her resolve, determined to understand, to endure, to learn the secrets of this ancient, malevolent light. And as the night stretched on, the lanterns multiplied, floating silently across the forest, each seeking a new wandering soul, each pulsing with hypnotic rhythm, each promising the same horrifying fate. And Mara realized that she had to adapt, to become more than prey, to survive within this otherworldly domain, to discover the rules of this realm where light and shadow, life and death, hope and despair intertwined. And though the fog wrapped around her like a living creature, though the whispers clawed at her mind, though the cold seeped into her very bones, she held on to herself, to the smallest fragment of identity, knowing that somewhere within this nightmare lay the key to escape, the key to understanding the lantern, and perhaps, one day, the power to free the souls trapped within its. The hypnotic glow of the lantern enveloped Mara, completely blinding yet mesmerizing, pulling her deeper into a reality that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. And as she floated among the suspended souls, she could feel their emotions pressing against her like waves: grief, fear, regret, longing, all intertwining into a suffocating atmosphere that threatened to erase her very sense of self. Yet within that oppressive weight, Mara clung to the thread of her identity, the faint but persistent knowledge that she was still alive, still herself. And as she focused, she began to notice patterns in the chaos. The way the lanterns moved, the rhythm of the whispers, the subtle shifts in the fog, as if the forest itself, the lantern itself, had rules she could learn and perhaps even bend to her will. And she realized that each soul trapped here was part of a story, a memory, a fragment of the past, echoing endlessly, and the lantern collected them, feeding on their despair, their longing, their unfulfilled desires. And Mara's heart ached as she glimpsed scenes of endless suffering, the child who never grew, the lover forever parted, the soldiers screaming across battlefields that stretched infinitely, each one caught in a loop of torment, each one unable to escape the lantern's pull. And yet, the moment of clarity came like a cold wind through her mind. The lantern's light was a conduit, a bridge, and if she could understand its rhythm, its intent, perhaps she could move without being claimed, perhaps she could survive, perhaps she could even fight. And with that thought, Mara began to test her own presence against the pull, taking careful steps, floating closer to the edge of the vortex, noticing that the whispers shifted, trying to seduce her, calling her name, tempting her with the promise of reunion, with comfort, with the end of her fears. And she resisted, focusing on the core of herself, the fire of her determination, and slowly she began to move with purpose, navigating the forest of souls, the trees of shadow and mist bending but not obstructing her, the lantern's glow pulsating around her like a heartbeat. And she realized she could manipulate her perception, that her will could push against the force of the light, and with each step she mapped the currents of energy, the paths that were safe, the traps that would snare her if she lost focus. And as she moved, the cloaked figure appeared again, closer this time, its presence immense, oppressive, a living embodiment of the lantern's power, and its unseen gaze seemed to pierce her very soul, testing her resolve. And Mara knew that if she faltered, even for a moment, she would be claimed. Another whisper in the eternal chorus, another lost soul added to the collection, and she pressed on, focusing on breathing, on control, on clarity. And as she moved, she began to notice subtle anomalies. The fog that shifted too perfectly, the shadows that recoiled, the faces in the mist that blinked in unison, signaling paths to avoid, traps disguised as safe routes. And with every observation, she grew stronger, more aware, more attuned to the world the lantern had created. And then she heard it, a whisper unlike the others, her own voice calling from within the mist, a guiding thread, a lifeline. And following it, she found herself approaching a clearing where the lantern's light was brightest. Yet here there was still a moment of choice, a fork in the path where the whispers wove a final temptation, the promise of absolute release from fear, from sorrow, from the weight of existence. And Mara hesitated, feeling the pressure, the pull, the desire to surrender. But then, in the silence between the whispers, she felt strength, the memory of her life, her family, her dreams, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the laughter of friends, the love she had known and cherished. And with that surge of determination, she stepped forward, breaking the lantern's hypnotic hold for a heartbeat, enough to glimpse the world beyond, enough to understand that the lantern's power was immense but not absolute, and she realized that if she could learn, adapt, and endure, she could navigate this realm, free herself, and perhaps one day release the souls trapped here. And as she moved through the clearing, weaving past shadows and whispers, Mara noticed the faintest glimmer of escape, a narrow passage of darkness untouched by the lantern's glow, beckoning her, a path that seemed impossible yet real, and she knew she had to risk everything to take it, to survive, to reclaim her freedom. And with a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness, the lantern's light flaring in rage behind her, the chorus of whispers rising to a deafening pitch. Yet she pressed on, moving through the shadows with a focus she had never known, feeling the energy of the realm push back but refusing to yield. And in that moment she felt the first spark of hope since entering this nightmare, a fragile flame that whispered, "You can endure, you can survive, you can overcome." And as the darkness enveloped her, carrying her away from the hypnotic glow, she realized that though the lantern would always exist, always seek, always claim, she was no longer simply prey. She was a survivor, a witness, a force that could learn its secrets, and perhaps in time, master them. And as the forest faded behind her and the faint glow of the lantern dimmed in the distance, Mara knew one unshakable truth. The lost would always call, the lantern would always wait, but the courage to face it, to resist it, and to endure was hers, and hers alone. And thank you for watching Shdows Secrit. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying stories from the shadows.